Hello, I'm here sitting with Mark Holborn. We're very privileged to be able to have a wonderful afternoon discussing the great Jose Eikoh. And I'm going to introduce a question and answer and a discussion between Lucy Fleming-Brown, who works with us on our Japanese photography, and Mark Holborn, who I feel needs no introduction, but is a Renaissance man who introduced me, certainly, to Japanese photography in 1991 at the seminal exhibition Beyond Japan. And Mark, thank you very much for inviting us into your home to discuss this extraordinary work.
So I was wondering if we could start our conversation by talking about when you first met Hosoe and what your first impression of meeting him was like, and how your relationship changed over the years.
I met him in Arles in the early 80s, I think probably 80, 81. And I made a trip, especially to try to see him. He was forthcoming, and I had at that point already conceived of the idea of Black Sun, the Eyes of Four, that I had already at that point thought of these four very different photographers with whom I wanted to talk and whose work I wanted to bring together to make an exhibition. Because I felt they were all telling similar stories, and they were all engaged in exploration of memory, yet they were completely different kinds of photographers. And they were, it turned out to be four of the 5 or 6 great photographers of the post-war era. So along with Hosoe was Tomatsu, Fukase and Moriyama. And Hosoe was, in a sense, the grand figure. So he was already internationally known. He was doing this workshop in Arles. He was quite westernized, spoke very good English. And he turned out to be the man with whom I could liaise most directly. So when I eventually returned to Tokyo to try and present this proposal, I did most of my work through Eikoh Hosoe, who acted with authority in bringing the other 3 figures to the table.
So between the generations, there was you perceived this connection that the 4 artists were working on separate projects, looking at memory.
Well, going backwards, this is what's so interesting, back into history and back into the seat of the imagination, and also back to memory. And I thought this is what's so important for us to learn about. We think photography is inescapably fixed on the present. It's this fraction of a second, it's a moment, it's all about nowness. Well, the events in Japan were so enormous, so inconceivably significant, portentous. The implication was so enormous for humanity as a whole that they couldn't deal with it. How do you find a language to record the events of 1945? Not just the 2 atomic explosions, but the concept of surrender, the concept of the emperor losing his divinity. So a restructuring of all the basic concepts in which you had been raised. So the national identity had suffered this enormous trauma. It's inconceivable, there's no parallel. So this was a society that was in transition almost from a pre-feudal past, a mythical past, a past based not on history but on mythology, and an imagination that followed that. And suddenly there's a full stop. Not only is there the disaster of the atomic explosions and the tangible loss of life and terrible human suffering, there's the loss of the war, the exposure of the propaganda, in a sense, falsehood, that they had been living through a falsehood. And it was very difficult to find a way to, how do you photograph that? Now there are photographs. Of course there are photographs. And I have struggled with this because I don't know if the photographs ever do justice to the enormity of the event. You see the rubble, you see the ruins. But these photographers are going back to a Japan that existed in their childhood with all its trauma.
So the first series that you chose to display of Hosoe's in this seminal exhibition was Kanaitachi. And I was wondering whether you actually met Hosoe's collaborator, the experimental dance pioneer and founder of the Eikoh movement, Hijikata Tatsumi. Because it looks from the photographs like he was a person of extraordinary personal energy and expressive powers. And I wondered whether in your time spent in Japan, you had the opportunity to see him dance.
Well, I was fascinated by Butoh. In fact, I did actually produce a book on Butoh, quite a big book on Butoh, with a photographer called Ethan Hoffman, who died shortly afterwards, tragically. But the book was published, and I wrote a long essay on Hijikata at that time. And I think that was around late 80s, early 90s. And Hijikata was extremely important. And to understand Hosoe's series Kanaitachi, you've got to really understand something about Hijikata. Hijikata himself had this incredible studio space, and the first time I went there, he had a class. I watched his classes. I think I returned there maybe 2 or 3 times. And he was amazingly handsome, broad-shouldered, slightly stooped, had this long mane of hair, sometimes tied up, tied back, had an extraordinary body, which you can see from the photographs, and he could push himself into an almost trance-like state. Hosoe photographed Hijikata in Tohoku, in the far north of Japan, and gone back to the village where Hijikata knew. And Hosoe was fascinated by Tohoku and that whole northern Japan. For people who don't know about Japan, it's a distant country up there. And it's rice fields and farmers' huts. And Kanaitachi itself, as you know, is a spirit, a divine force, and also a frightening force. There's something demonic about it. So the dance that Hijikata performed through the rice fields is one of possession, of a man possessed by this spirit. But the spirit is also like a princess, like a Mishkin, Dostoevsky, innocent, an idiot, who is also can deal with the children, can communicate with the children, can play with the children, but can fly across the rooftops and represent something terrifying. And the force of the wind of Kanaitachi could slash your body as if with 1,000 razors. So this was the monstrous weapon that came out of the sky with a terrible wind. And this is unforgettable. And the symbolism is so obvious to anybody growing up after the events of 1945. So it took till 1968
for the meaning
to approach it, and then the way to approach it was to reconstruct it through a legend.
So Hosoe was invited by Mission's publisher to embark on a new extended photographic portrait series.
It was just going to be a straightforward picture. So the publisher, and so the writer said, well, I like this, get Hosoe. So Hosoe showed up at the house. And then that's when everything happened. So some point in the early 60s, wherever it is, in 1961, Hosoe got a call from Mishima's publisher saying, will you go over and see the writer and take a photograph for a jacket? And he showed up at the house with Moriyama, who was his assistant at the time. And they got to the house, and that's when the story began. Mishima's father was standing in the garden with a hose, the garden hose. And the house, as we know, was extraordinary. And yeah, there's a book was published by Kinshin Shiniyama recording the house. It was furnished with a lot of props from film studios and strange bodybuilding trophies, kendo fencing trophies, and a lot of references to Western classicism. So the house outside in the garden had a mosaic with astrological signs. And rather than do a conventional portrait, Hosoe suggested that Mishima was stripped down, was undressed. And
I believe he was sunbathing at the time.
yeah, and he was so, he's so proud of his body. And he wrapped him in the garden hose and had him lie down on the zodiac. And there's that first picture with, you see him wrapped in the hose. And something happened, something very important happened. I think it was that Mishima was suddenly not in control. And it's probably the first time that this man for whom action had become the predominant force, a man of action as opposed to a man of words. He wanted to exercise his will for his action. Suddenly had his will removed and was under the direction of another person. And he had a choice. And he submitted to it. So he submitted to the direction. I think that's the pivotal moment. And once that had happened, they could go anywhere. And so he allowed this process of photographing to continue, and it became more and more elaborate.
Until this dynamic was established where they were creating incredibly sophisticated and abstract pictures, often composite images. The Mishima can't have envisioned at the time that he was being shot how the end result would actually look. That's ceding a lot of creative control to someone who, presumably through their bodybuilding and their literature, had a very planned image for how they wanted to present themselves.
Yeah, and or you can look at a print and just realize how excessive and baroque it had become, how elaborate, so that Mishima might be wearing jewelry. You can see that this is a table with a clock.
Familiar from his hallway.
In his hallway. And there he is crouched underneath it. Then also added to it are these elements from Renaissance European city and other figures and clouds. And so the photographs became very layered. And the genius was, technically it was incredible because we're in the pre-computer age, all this was being done in the darkroom. So it was very, very advanced, and it enabled him to cross over and bridge the gap between the Renaissance world, which Mishima adored, just as he adored the classical world, the Greek and Roman classical world. He adored French literature. And he could impose his own perfect body in loincloth or in Levi jeans into that space. He constructed a kind of theatre. And so a lot of his projects or series were very theatrical. and the involved performers. And that's what made him extraordinary.